In a chilling moment at O'Hare Airport, two cops aggressively detained and handcuffed a black man, mistaking him for a common suspect. Their smug triumph turned to sheer panic when he revealed he's the FBI director. The jaw-dropping fallout will leave you speechless. He was stopped by two police officers. The reason? A vague report about a suspicious person. Their looks, their tone, everything about them was laced with judgment and prejudice. He tried to stay calm, respond with reason, asserting his civil rights, but his composure only seemed to fan the flames. The insults came quickly, targeting his skin color, his supposed inferiority. To them, any resistance, even the slightest, was intolerable. They saw only a defiant black man who in their minds needed to be taught a lesson. Then the worst happened. Amid the shouts and stunned gazes of onlookers, he was subdued with force. The cold snap of handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed. A successful, respected man, now treated like a dangerous criminal in broad daylight. The two officers reveled in their actions, convinced they'd achieved a feat, taught this man a lesson, but they had no idea of the fatal mistake they'd just made. They were completely unaware of who this man truly was, the man they'd just insulted and cuffed. As the night in Chicago drew to a close, a United Airlines plane touched down gently on runway 28R at O'Hare International Airport. Marcus Hale exhaled softly, a subtle gesture unnoticed by those around him in the sparse first-class cabin, but one that carried immense relief after a nearly 4-hour flight from Washington, D.C. His unscheduled trip to a closed-door security conference in Europe had stretched longer than expected, and all he wanted now was to get home, to the rare tranquility he could find amid his hectic routine. He waited patiently until the seatbelt sign turned off and the plane pulled up to gate B12. At nearly 60, Marcus Hale retained the tall, lean frame of someone who'd spent much of his life in law enforcement and intelligence. His gray hair was neatly trimmed, his face stern but his eyes sharp, calm, with a gaze that instinctively observed. Dressed in a well-tailored but understated suit and a slightly loosened dark blue tie, his presence exuded professionalism and authority without drawing attention, a skill honed over years of working in the shadows and the political spotlight. He carried only a black leather briefcase filled with classified documents and a small bag of personal items. No entourage, no visible Secret Service escort. How he often traveled for unofficial or highly confidential missions to avoid unnecessary attention in public. Airports, with their crowds and potential chaos, were always a high liquor environment, even for the head of the United States' most powerful investigative agency. When the plane doors opened, Hale reluctantly joined the flow of disembarking passengers, pulling his small suitcase with the briefcase tucked securely under his arm. He walked with purpose, his eyes scanning the surroundings out of professional habit. Faces, gestures, abandoned objects. It was an automatic reflex, a constant assessment for anything out of the ordinary. The waiting area of Terminal 1 was packed, despite the late afternoon hour. Overhead speakers announced flights, suitcase wheels clattered on the floor, and voices of all kinds created the usual airport cacophony. Hale kept a prudent distance from others, moving silently toward the connecting flights area for his next leg to Washington, D.C. He had no checked luggage, a habit that saved time and reduced risks. Meanwhile, not far from Gate B12, two Chicago Police Department officers patrolled the airport. Officer Tom Bradley, a white man in his 50s with a face etched by exhaustion and discontent, leaned against a pillar, staring blankly at passers-by. Beside him was Officer Jake Carter, younger, in his 30s, also white with a bit more energy but lacking the confidence of experience. Bradley grumbled about endless shifts and how underpaid he was. He'd been on the job too long to not feel jaded and cynical. His racial and class biases were so ingrained that he'd turned security into an excuse to unleash his personal frustrations on those he deemed out of place or suspicious. Suddenly, his shoulder radio crackled briefly before falling silent. A message popped up on his handheld device, a report from an airport security agent about a suspicious individual near Gate B12. The details were maddeningly vague: a black man in dark clothing, acting nervous, walking alone. No specific behavior, no clear indication of a crime, just a subjective impression based on superficial factors. Bradley skimmed the message, a malicious smirk creeping across his weathered face. His gaze slid over the crowd exiting Gate B12 and locked onto Marcus Hale, the only black man in sight who vaguely matched the absurdly generic description. "Look, Jake," Bradley said, nudging his younger partner. "Looks like we've got a potential customer, just as described." His voice carried a hint of satisfaction. Carter followed Bradley's gaze and saw Hale walking calmly. He hesitated. The man seemed entirely normal, even exuding a certain authority. But Bradley was the veteran, and Carter was used to following orders, trusting his judgment, even when it was tinged with prejudice. "Yeah, he fits," Carter said uncertainly, trying to sound like he'd noticed something suspicious too. Bradley needed no further encouragement. He pushed off the pillar, adjusted his cap, and strode toward Hale with Carter in tow, adopting a posture that tried to project authority but already hinted at something more: arrogance. They stopped him so abruptly that Hale nearly halted mid-step. "Sir, stop!" Bradley's voice was sharp, devoid of respect. Marcus Hale paused, turning to face the two officers. His expression showed no surprise or fear, only a faint glimmer of irritation deep in his eyes. He'd been through this before, though less frequently in recent years, since his status had changed. Still, he knew the feeling well. Being watched, judged, simply because of his skin color. "Is there a problem, officers?" His voice was low, firm, controlled. The voice of someone accustomed to handling tense situations without losing composure. But to Bradley, that calm was an act of defiance. He stepped closer, eyeing Hale from head to toe, standing closer than necessary, a calculated move to apply pressure. "We've got a report about a suspicious person matching your description in this area," Bradley said, his tone implying it was an indisputable fact. "Please, show me your ID." Hale remained composed but didn't comply without question. "What's the specific report, officer?" he asked, his voice steady but with a subtle edge. "May I know what I'm suspected of?" "My understanding is that reasonable suspicion is required to detain a citizen and demand their documents." He spoke with legal precision, not to boast, but to remind them of the boundaries of their authority. His exact words and controlled demeanor seemed to irritate Bradley further, who despised confidence, especially from black men he considered inferior. "Don't ask so many questions," Bradley snapped impatiently. "This is an airport. We have the right to check anyone. Just show your papers. Got something to hide?" His gaze turned hostile. Hale realized arguing legalities would only escalate things. He sighed discreetly, reached into his jacket, pulled out his wallet and handed Bradley his Virginia driver's license. He knew the out-of-state address would only fuel their suspicions. Bradley snatched the license, glanced at the details, and looked up with contempt. "Marcus Hale, huh? From Virginia?" he muttered with a mocking smile. "What the hell are you doing in Chicago? Dressed like you're headed to a White House meeting? Doesn't look like you're here for family or a vacation." His tone dripped with sarcasm and judgment. Officer Carter, seeing his superior take charge, chimed in boldly, trying to prove he could spot a suspect too. Or maybe he's on a mission, transporting contraband, chasing a target. The accusations were baseless, thrown out solely because of Hale's skin color, attire, and the vague report. Anger began to simmer in Marcus Hale's chest. He'd dedicated his life to serving this country, upholding law and justice, and now he endured humiliation and baseless accusations from the very men who, in theory, should protect those principles. But decades of experience and discipline kept him steady. He knew losing control would only spring the trap they were setting. "I'm here for work," Hale replied, his voice cold but measured. "And I'll repeat," he said, controlled but firm, "my work or my attire is none of your concern. It certainly doesn't constitute a legitimate reason to detain me, interrogate me like this, or throw out insulting insinuations." Bradley let out a cruel, scornful laugh. "Work trip? Ha! What kind of mysterious, sneaky business trip or some shady deal people like you get into?" The phrase "people like you" was spat with unmistakable venom, its racial undertone clear. This time Hale couldn't stay silent, his gaze locked onto Bradley with chilling intensity. "Officer," he said, his voice low but brimming with authority, "your words are not only wildly inappropriate, they're blatantly discriminatory. I demand you stop this attitude and language immediately. Your conduct has crossed the line into unacceptable." Being directly called out for discrimination by a black man was a slap to Bradley's fragile pride. He exploded, his face red with fury. "When did I discriminate?" he shouted, spewing insults and adopting a crude, utterly disrespectful tone. "You're the one in question here. Don't lecture me. Who do you think you are?" Hale stood firm, his gaze unwavering, not backing down from the officer's rage. I'm a United States citizen and I have the right to be free from harassment and abuse by law enforcement. I have no obligation to answer your irrelevant, personally offensive questions. If you don't have probable cause, based on concrete evidence, to arrest me, then please step aside and let me pass. With that, he shifted slightly, intending to move forward. To Bradley, this was the final straw, a direct challenge to his authority. You dare walk away, he roared, resisting an officer? You're definitely hiding something. He turned to Carter, eyes blazing with aggression. Stop him. He might be armed. Grab him. It was a blatant lie, said only to justify the violence about to unfold. Carter hesitated for a split second, seeing the calm resolve in Hale's eyes, but he couldn't resist Bradley's commanding order. Swept up in the escalating tension and his own instincts, he obeyed, lunging toward Hale to grab his arm. Hale, with reflexes honed by years of facing danger, reacted instantly to defend himself. He didn't attack, he deftly turned, brushing Carter's arm away with a sharp movement. "Don't touch me," he shouted, his voice betraying contained rage for the first time. That act of legitimate self-defense was immediately twisted by both officers as aggression. "See? He's resisting," Bradley yelled, throwing himself at Hale too. A brief but violent struggle erupted in the middle of the airport concourse. Passengers panicked, scattering quickly, some pulling out phones to record the chaos. Hale, despite his height and defensive training, knew fighting back would only worsen things and endanger others. He tried to maintain balance, protecting himself without attacking, all while loudly denouncing the unjustified violence. But the strength of the two younger, aggressive officers prevailed. They slammed him to the ground with force. The impact dazed him momentarily. His briefcase and bag fell, spilling personal items across the floor. Carter seized the moment, yanking out metal handcuffs and roughly twisting Hale's arms behind his back. The cold steel snapped shut tightly around his wrists, sending a sharp pain, followed by numbness, through his arms. The physical pain paled compared to the humiliation and fury consuming him. He was being treated like a dangerous criminal in public, all for daring to stand up for his rights against injustice and prejudice. Bradley, panting, looked down at Hale with a twisted, triumphant smile. "See?" he sneered, voice dripping with mockery. "Told you! You're the stubborn, uppity type. Now you'll have to talk pretty at the station." He crouched, picked up Hale's driver's license, waved it tauntingly in his face, and pocketed it. "Let's see if you keep that smart mouth there." Marcus Hale clenched his teeth, stifling a groan of pain and frustration. He closed his eyes briefly, took a deep breath, and fought to regain control. This fight wasn't over. It was just beginning, in the worst way possible. The two officers hoisted him up by his armpits. His expensive suit was now disheveled, his jacket askew, one pant knee faintly stained from the fall, but when he opened his eyes there was no fear or desperation in them, only a cold, deep resolve that unnerved anyone who met his gaze, even in his vulnerable state. Bradley, still furious and intoxicated by his display of power, leaned closer, his voice thick with malice, aiming to humiliate further. "Well, Hale," he spat the name mockingly, "you like playing tough, huh? Talking about your rights to cops. And now what? Who do you think you are to stand up to us?" The question wasn't meant to be answered. It was a venomous taunt, a final attempt to break the spirit of the man they'd subdued. Hale, wrists aching from the tight cuffs, straightened as much as he could. He locked eyes with Bradley's furious glare, and his voice came out clear, eerily calm amid the growing murmurs of the surrounding crowd. "I am Marcus Hale," he said simply, directly, without a hint of submission. Bradley smirked smugly. "Yeah, I know you're Hale. So what? That name means nothing here. You're just another troublemaker." Hale didn't respond to the taunt. His gaze remained fixed on Bradley, cold and unrelenting. Then he spoke again, slowly, each word deliberate and sharp, like an invisible hammer striking the tense air. "Director." A brief silence hung in the air. Bradley and Carter stared, waiting. "Of the Federal Bureau of Investigation?" The final words landed with absolute certainty, without a trace of doubt. "FBI." Silence crashed over the small pocket of the airport. The usual bustle of O'Hare seemed to vanish, leaving only a ringing in the ears and the stunned gazes of officers Tom Bradley and Jake Carter. Bradley's smirk froze, then melted into a look of total disbelief. The furious red of his face drained to a ghostly white. His eyes widened, fixed on Hale as if he'd heard something impossible, as if the handcuffed man before him had transformed into someone else. Cold sweat beaded on his forehead and temples. His mouth opened to speak, but only incoherent fragments came out. You said what?" he finally stammered, his voice cracked, trembling. "The director of the FBI." He stumbled back a step, eyes bulging with terror. Officer Jake Carter, the younger of the two, reacted even worse. At those 3 words he froze, his face drained of color. The hands gripping Hale's cuffed arms fell limp by reflex. He looked at Hale, then at Bradley, with a desperate, pleading expression, then down at the handcuffs, as if just realizing who they'd restrained and arrested. Absolute fear gripped his mind. "God, no," he whispered, voice shaking. "No, it can't be true." His legs buckled, knees trembling. The sudden shift in the officer's demeanor, from arrogant aggression to abject panic, was so stark that even the onlookers, though unaware of the full context, sensed something monumental had just happened. Murmurs fell silent, replaced by curious, shocked glances toward the trio. Phones kept recording, capturing this astonishingly dramatic moment. Bradley was the first to snap out of his stupor, driven by survival instinct. The fear of catastrophic consequences, losing his job, facing prosecution, going to jail, overrode all else. He rushed toward Hale, nearly dropping to his knees, his voice now pleading, urgent, desperate. "Sir, Mr. Director, oh God, please forgive us," he stammered, his face pale and sweaty. This is a terrible mistake, a horrible mistake. We really didn't know who you are." He spun toward Carter, who stood frozen, and shouted in a trembling, panicked voice, "Carter, you idiot! What are you standing there for? Uncuff him, uncuff the director, now, hurry! You want us both locked up?" Carter jolted as if shocked, fumbling for the keys on his belt. His hands shook so badly the keys slipped to the floor. He dropped to retrieve them, his face blank, scrambling for the right key. Precious seconds of tense silence passed before he finally slid the key into the lock. A sharp click sounded as the cuffs opened, freeing Marcus Hale's deeply marked wrists. Meanwhile, Bradley kept begging, his voice choked with tears and belated regret. "We're so sorry, Director. It's just the report was so vague. We were just trying to do our job. Maybe we went a bit too far. Please forgive us, please. Don't ruin our careers. We have families." Marcus Hale slowly stretched his hands, rubbing the sore marks on his wrists. He said nothing, offered no response to the desperate pleas, showed neither anger nor forgiveness. He simply stood there, silent, watching the 2 cowering men with a cold, piercing gaze of judgment. The FBI director's silence was 1,000 times more terrifying than any accusation or threat. It signaled a storm was coming. As the air thickened with Bradley and Carter's panic and Marcus Hale's unnerving silence, a deep, authoritative voice cut through the dispersing crowd. "What the hell is going on here?" Lieutenant Robert Evans, the on-duty Chicago Police Department officer at O'Hare, strode quickly toward the group. A white man in his 40s with a serious, professional demeanor, he'd likely heard about the disturbance via radio or a passenger's quick call, flanked by 2 other officers ready to assist. Evans' eyes scanned the scene and immediately grasped the unusual situation. Marcus Hale, a black man in a suit with red wrists, facing his 2 subordinates, Bradley and Carter, who were on the verge of collapse. Pale, sweating, and stammering incoherent apologies. Evans didn't recognize Hale right away, but knew enough to sense his officers had made a catastrophic error. "Bradley, Carter," he barked, "report the situation, now." Bradley and Carter tried to stand at attention, but were visibly shaken and terrified. Bradley attempted an explanation, but his words were jumbled, contradictory, blaming faulty reports and misunderstandings. Evans wasn't easily fooled. He turned to Hale, who remained eerily calm. "Sir," Evans said respectfully, sensing an unusual aura about the man, "I'm Lieutenant Evans, in charge of this area. It seems an unfortunate incident has occurred. Could you tell me what happened?" Marcus Hale spoke then, his voice still low and steady, showing no agitation or fear. "Lieutenant Evans," he began, "I am Marcus Hale." He paused, letting the name settle. "I was unjustly detained by your officers based on a baseless report. They interrogated me with insulting, discriminatory questions. When I demanded to know the reason and refused to answer inappropriate questions, they accused me of resisting arrest, used excessive force, and handcuffed me." Evans listened intently, his face growing graver. He recognized the name Marcus Hale, though he hadn't yet made the full connection. Hale continued, his voice unwavering. "Lieutenant Evans, I consider the actions of Officer Bradley and Officer Carter a gross violation of my civil rights and the professional standards of your police department." He locked eyes with Evans. "And to be clear, Lieutenant, I am the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The final sentence hit Evans like a thunderbolt. He froze momentarily, staring at Hale, then at his two subordinates, now completely paralyzed with fear. He finally understood their terror. He'd heard of FBI Director Marcus Hale, but had never met him in person. What he faced now dwarfed any prior situation. His reaction was swift and professional. He turned to Bradley and Carter, voice firm. "You two, surrender your weapons, badges, and radios immediately. You're suspended indefinitely pending investigation." He gestured to the two officers with him. "They'll escort you to the security office." Bradley and Carter complied without protest, defeated, knowing their fate was all but sealed. After they were led away, Lieutenant Evans turned to Director Hale, his face solemn and sincere. "Director Hale," he said, "on behalf of the Chicago Police Department, I offer our deepest, most sincere apologies for the utterly unacceptable behavior of the officers under my command. This is an extremely serious and shameful situation. We commit to a transparent, rigorous internal investigation with the utmost seriousness." Hale nodded slightly, acknowledging the apology, though his expression remained cold. "Lieutenant, I appreciate your professionalism. I request that this incident be officially documented immediately, and most importantly, that all video and audio footage from the body cameras of Officers Bradley and Carter be preserved in its entirety, unaltered. That will be the core of the evidence." "Your request will be followed to the letter, Mr. Director," Evans replied. "We'll cooperate fully with the investigation even at the federal level." Soon after, news of the shocking incident reached the highest levels of the Chicago Police Department, the mayor's office, and of course, the FBI and Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. A seismic ripple coursed through the law enforcement community. The investigation moved swiftly, conducted in close collaboration between CPD Internal Affairs, the DOJ's Civil Rights Division, and the FBI. Body camera footage became irrefutable evidence, showing the vague report, Bradley's offensive and racist remarks, Carter's violence and complicity, and the moment both panicked upon learning Hale's true identity, their personnel records were also scrutinized. As feared, Bradley had a troubling history of complaints for brutality, abuse of power, and discriminatory language, often downplayed, dismissed, or ignored. Carter, while less egregious, showed a lack of independent judgment and a tendency to follow orders, even clearly wrongful ones. The investigation went beyond the two officers, questioning systemic issues within the police department. Was there cover-up or tolerance of such behavior? The FBI director's case unintentionally became a powerful catalyst, exposing dark corners. The findings were conclusive. Tom Bradley and Jake Carter were fired from the Chicago Police Department for gross violations of ethical codes, abuse of authority, and racial discrimination. But the consequences didn't end there. Given the case's severity and overwhelming evidence, including videos and the FBI director's own testimony, the Department of Justice opted to prosecute them under federal law. They were charged with violating civil rights under color of law, per Title 18, Section 242 of the U.S. Code, and faced potential additional state charges in Illinois for assault and unlawful detention. The trial of Tom Bradley and Jake Carter drew massive media and public attention. It wasn't just about two rogue cops. It was a critical test of police accountability and the fight against systemic racism in the justice system. In the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Illinois, the atmosphere was tense. Bradley and Carter, seated at the defense table, looked aged, defeated, their faces etched with worry. Gone was the arrogance from that day at O'Hare. The prosecution, led by DOJ attorneys, presented an airtight case, arguing the defendants acted out of racial prejudice, abused their authority, and betrayed public trust. The full video was shown to the jury, every word and action of Bradley and Carter laid bare. The audience reacted with shock and dismay. The trial's climax was Marcus Hale's testimony. Appearing in a pristine suit, he spoke with calm, without anger or vengeance. His precise, objective, dignified testimony carried immense weight. He spoke not just as a victim but as a leader of the justice system, condemning those who tarnish their badge. The defense tried to downplay the charges, claiming it was a misunderstanding caused by job stress and erroneous reports. They argued their clients were remorseful and had no racist intent, but their words couldn't counter the damning evidence. After days of trial, the jury deliberated in silence. When they returned, their faces were expressionless. The jury foreman stood and read the verdict. In the case of the defendant, Tom Bradley, for violation of civil rights under color of law, the jury finds him guilty. For third-degree assault, guilty. Each guilty landed like a hammer. Both former officers were found guilty on all major charges. Bradley bowed his head, trembling. Carter closed his eyes, tears streaming down his face. Weeks later, at the sentencing hearing, the federal judge emphasized the crime's severity. Committed by those meant to protect society, not abuse their power. Racial discrimination, she said, staring at Bradley and Carter, is a cancer that undermines public trust and must be eradicated. Your actions not only harmed your victim, but also thousands of honest officers who risk their lives daily. She delivered the ruling. Tom Bradley and Jake Carter were sentenced to 6 years in federal prison, a strong sentence sending a clear message that racism and abuse of power would not be tolerated. Both broke down at the verdict, led away by marshals, beginning their path to justice for mistakes made in mere minutes at O'Hare. Marcus Hale watched the sentencing in silence. When the ruling was announced, he nodded slightly, not in satisfaction, but in acknowledgement that justice had been served. Sunset light filtered through the windows of his office in the J. Edgar Hoover Building in Washington, D.C. Hale gazed quietly toward Pennsylvania Avenue. Months had passed since the trial, but the aftermath lingered. He felt no victory. He knew his case was resolved swiftly and effectively because of who he was. His position had been both shield and sword. But what if he'd just been an ordinary citizen? Would his words have been believed? Would the footage have been taken seriously? Would Bradley and Carter have been fired and prosecuted? Likely not. The O'Hare incident was a bitter personal experience, but also a painful reminder of a larger reality. Racism and abuse of power remain deeply entrenched, even in the system he leads. His story is just the tip of the iceberg. Countless others, perhaps millions, face unjust suspicion, unequal treatment, and violence daily without a voice or protection. Hale sighed, stepped away from the window, and sat at his desk. The responsibility he bore was immense, not just leading the FBI, but setting an example, driving change from within, building an institution that truly upholds human rights and tolerates no discrimination. His case was over, but the fight had only begun. This story underscores a vital truth. Unchecked bias and authority can spiral into devastating wrongs, fracturing trust and perpetuating harm. It challenges us to examine our own assumptions, demand accountability from those in power, and champion justice relentlessly. In our daily lives, this means actively rejecting stereotypes, amplifying marginalized voices, and pushing for systemic reform. Every step, whether calling out injustice, supporting fair policies, or educating others, builds a foundation for equality. Thank you for engaging with this powerful narrative. If it resonated, hit like, share it widely, and subscribe to fuel these critical discussions. Comment below. What actions will you take to combat bias, and how can we unite for a fairer world? Let's drive change together.